Chapter 4 of Prussianism and Socialism by Oswald Spengler, on Marx. The intense final struggle of the two Germanic ideals is now strongly affected by a wholly different factor, the labour problem. On the one side, a philosophical dichotomy of the most inward sort is striving towards a resolution that will give Faustian existence its final unified pattern. On the other side, a physical state of emergency is demanding changes in external living conditions. The former is thus a question of metaphysics, the latter one of political economics. We must bear in mind this qualitative difference between the two phenomena. The problem of the fourth estate makes its appearance in every culture during the transition to civilization. In Germany, this began in the 19th century. Suddenly, Rousseau was obsolete. The third estate belonged to the city, which placed itself on even footing with the farmlands. The fourth estate was a product of megapolis, which annihilated the farmlands. A very late phenomenon in any given culture, the fourth estate is composed of a nomad-like masses which, formless and indeed hostile to all form, surge through the stony labyrinths, choking up the remainders of living humanity. It's a homeless and frustrated group, filled with hatred of the strict gradations of the old culture that is unwilling to recognise it, and longing for a liberation from its impossible plight. Western European civilization, in all its forms and manifestations, is dominated by the machine industry. The industrial worker is not at all the fourth estate, and yet he justifiably considers himself a representative of that group. He is a symbol. As a type, he originated from the civilization, and he deeply feels the anomaly of his existence. If other are the slaves of the age in technology, the businessman as well as the engineer, then he is the slave. But there is no solution to the labour problem for the worker alone, or by him alone. Strictly speaking, the fourth estate is a simple fact, not an idea. And in the face of facts, there can only be material compromises, not as the effect or realisation of an ideal, but as the strategic result of a pragmatic struggle for advantages over others. In the end, following all the accidents and the vagaries of the struggle, one attains and resignedly accepts what amounts to a deadlock that affords a certain measure of passive well-being, a Chinese kind of happiness, the happiness of imperial Rome, panem et circenses. It is difficult to imagine that today, for we stand at the high point of mass excitement in the big cities and, as a result of the slogan-barking close-range observers, have tended to overestimate the prospects of class egoism. But in 1 or 2 centuries, all this will pass, unless the labour movement enters the service of a general idea. What remained of the high passion of the period of Gracchi during Augustus's reign? The problem had not been solved, it had only been dissolved. This is where Marx comes in. By means of a brilliant intellectual calculation, more overwhelming than correct, he tried to elevate the facts to the rank of an idea. Across the powerful antithesis between Viking and Nazi principles, he stretched out a thin but cohesive theory, thereby inventing a popular view of history that's in fact widely accepted in the present day. He was born in the Prussian atmosphere and later entered the atmosphere of England, but he remained a foreigner to the spiritual life of both peoples. As a citizen of the scientific 19th century, he was a good materialist but a bad psychologist, and therefore he failed ultimately to impart the quality of an idea to the great realities. Instead, he reduced ideas to concepts and single interests. Instead of the English blood, which he does not feel within himself, he espied only English things and concepts. And of Hegel, who by and large represented Prussianism at its best, the only thing accessible to Marx was the method. Thus it happens that, by means of a truly grotesque calculation, he transforms the instinctual dichotomy between the two Germanic races into a material dichotomy between two class levels. To the proletariat, the fourth estate, he ascribes the Prussian idea of socialism, while to the bourgeoisie, the third estate, he assigns the English idea of capitalism. These are the false equations that have given the rise to the four concepts whose concrete meaning everyone is familiar with today. With these catchwords, so irresistible in their simplicity, he succeeded in consolidating the labour force of practically all countries into a class possessing a distinct class consciousness. Today, the Fourth Estate talks in his language and thinks in his concepts. Proletariat, after Marx, was no longer a name but a challenge. Beginning with Marx, the future was seen through a piece of literature. The strength of the system lies in its superficiality. There still exists a Spanish ecclesiastical, an English capitalistic, and a Prussian authoritative socialism. In addition to proletarian movements of anarchic, capitalistic, and generally socialist character, but no one is aware of them. Faith in the unified nature of the goal is stronger than reality, as this faith is always in the Western world adheres to a book. To doubt its absolute truth is a crime. It was the printed words that first guaranteed that the Faustian spirit would exert its influence beyond all limits of space and time. In the English Revolution, it was the Bible. In the French Revolution, Rousseau's Contrat Social. In the German Revolution, the Communist Manifesto. From his reinterpretation of racial strife as a strife between classes, and of an ancient Germanic instinct as very recent impulses of large city populations, Marx derives his central concept of class conflict. The horizontal structuring of historical forces was made vertical, that is, the meaning of the materialist view of history. The scientific mentality of the time required that matter and energy be regarded as opposites. The matter of political energy was peoples and nations, that of economic energy, the classes. Marxism reversed the importance of these two energies, and thus also of the two matters, and the word class thereby took on a completely new meaning. With the psychological naivete of a scientifically trained mind of 1950, Marx failed to comprehend the difference between class and estate. An estate is an ethical concept, the expression of an idea. The privileged segment of society in 1789 was distinguished from the bourgeoisie as an estate embodying the formal ideal of the grandeur courtoisie, an inward and outward nobility, no matter how much has been eroded by decadent living. It was only after the bourgeoisie had contested the ethical superiority of the older aristocratic modes of behaviour that it made an issue of social privileges. The Partisans used their English school's intelligence to substitute a new ideal for the old, and their French instinct created out of this substitution the principle of equality in the ethical sense. It was the new meaning of the expression human society, equality of all men, and the universal binding force of a moral ideal based not on blood and tradition, but on nature and reason. Class, on the other hand, is a purely economic concept, and in the 1950s it took the space of the ethical and political concept of the bourgeoisie of 1789. The ideal of a state became class interest. It was only in England that the classes had long since been stratified according to wealth. The middle class was comprised of those who lived by their work without actually being poor. The upper class was rich without working. The lower class worked and was poor. In Prussia, however, it was rank, i.e. a greater or lesser degree of command and obedience, that separated the classes. Besides the peasantry, there existed a civil servant class, that is to say, there was a unity of function rather than economic distinctions. By the way of contrast, modern France is distinguished by the absence of real classes. The French nation is a disordered mass in which one can discern rich individuals and poor individuals, yet classes as such have not emerged. The entire nation is one class, not as rigorously stratified as the Germanic nations, but nonetheless single and unified. Marx was thus an exclusively English thinker. His two-class system derives from the situation of a mercantile people that sacrificed its agriculture to big business and that never had possessed a national corps of civil servants which pronounced, i.e. Prussian, estate consciousness. In England, there was only the bourgeoisie and the proletarians, active and passive agents in business affairs, robbers and robbed. The whole system very Viking-like. Transferred to the realm of Prussian political ideals, these concepts make no sense. Marx would never have been able to distinguish English industrial slavery from the principle that emerges from the all-for-all idea, whereby every individual is a servant of the total state, regardless of rank or position. He took a wholly external image of Prussianism, organisation, discipline, cooperation, all things that are independent of any single class, a technical pattern, socialism, and handed it over to the labourers in a society of the English type as a weapon and a goal, exhorting them to be good Vikings and to switch the roles of robbers and robbed, to expropriate the expropriators, and he wrapped it all up in an egoistic programme that called for the sharing of the spoils after victory. The best definition of the two classes is still logical embarrassment. Within the Marxist system, bourgeoisie means something completely different than it did to Rousseau. It is one thing if one uses the term in the context of privileged groups in the age of feudalism, and quite another if it applies to the masses of urban workers. Consequently, with respect to the three estates of 1789, there is no longer any fourth estate, and with respect to today's fourth estate, there is no longer any first or second. CA is estimated the clergy at 80,000, the aristocracy at 120,000, and the third estate at 25 million. Accordingly, the latter group constituted the people. Bourgeoisie means altogether. Even the French peasant is a bourgeois. The fourth estate, however, is a minority and difficult to separate from others. The dividing lines are different, depending on whether one speaks of craftsmen, industrial workers, proletarians, or masses. At times it is defined, and more often still it is felt, as differing hardly at all from the bourgeoisie. Once again, it is altogether with the exception of the business employers. The third estate was in point of fact a negative concept. It was invented to express the idea that there should no longer be any estates at all. But the fourth estate cancelled out this calculation. It assigns for a single occupational group the prime importance in the life of society. It reached back beyond 1789 and presents itself as another privileged estate. That is what the notion of dictatorship of the proletariat essentially means, the domination of society by a class that is not at all certain of its numerical superiority. This means, of course, that the Marxist class goal is in reality a caricature of the old estate ideal. The entire Marxist construct is nothing but literature and has nothing to do with blood or breeding. But the follies of the German Revolution, the workers' Soviets and a new upper house, the elevation of the workers to the position of English gentlemen by means of a strike that guaranteed continued wage payments, all of this has demonstrated, as in the days of Cromwell and Robespierre, that literature can engender, temporarily at least, grotesque reality. Marxian morality is likewise of English origin. Marxism reveals in every sentence that the thought process from which it sprang were theological and not political. Its economic theory is the outgrowth of a fundamental moral attitude, and the materialistic view of history is simply the final chapter of a philosophy with roots in the English Revolution, whose biblical muse have remained dominant in English thought. That is why Marx's basic concepts are felt to be moral alternatives. The words socialism and capitalism are terms for the good and evil of this irreligious religion. The bourgeois is the devil, the rage earner is the angel of a new mythology, and one only needs to sample the vulgar parts of the Communist Manifesto to recognise behind the literary mask of the Christianity of the independents. Social evolution is the will of God, quote unquote, the so-called final goal in an earlier age, which was the eternal salvation instead. The collapse of the bourgeois civilization used to be called the Last Judgment. Marx long succeeded in preaching contempt for work. Perhaps he did not realise this himself. Work, long, hard, tiring work, is for him a misfortune, and effortless gain is a blessing. Behind the typically English disdain for the man who lives by the sweat of his brow, we can feel the instinct of the Viking, whose vocation is piracy and not patching sails. For this reason, the manual labourer is more a slave in England than anywhere else, and his slavery is moral. He feels that his profession precludes his bearing of the title of gentleman. The concepts bourgeoisie and proletariat reflects the typically English preference for business rather than manual work. The former is a blessing, the latter a calamity. The one is noble, the other base. But with their hatred, the misfortunate ones say business is the evil occupation, manual labour the good. But of course, not over mental work. Just as the English intellectual was by choice either a Tory or a Whig, he had to choose between the two new economic parties. Being a gentleman, he has naturally opted for big business. This is the explanation for the mental attitude which gave rise to Marx's social criticism and which made him so catastrophic for true socialism. He knew the nature of work only from the English viewpoint, as a means of getting rich, as a means lacking in all moral depth. Only success in money, the visible and tangible signs of God's grace, were of ethical import. The Englishman has no inkling of the dignity of hard work. For him, work is a debasing thing, an ugly necessity. Pity the poor soul who has nothing but work, who owes nothing without more and more work, but who, above all, will never have wealth in the future. Had Marx understood the meaning of Prussian work, of an activity for its own sake, of service in the name of the totality, for all together, and not for oneself, of duty that ennobles regardless of the kind of work performed, had he been able to comprehend these things, his manifesto would probably never have been written. On this matter, he was aided by his Jewish instinct, which he himself categorized in his essay on the Jewish question. The curse of physical labour pronounced in the beginning of Genesis, the prohibition against the defining of the Sabbath by work, these things made him receptive to the Old Testament pathos of the English sensibility. Hence, his hatred of those who do not need to work. The socialism of a feast would accuse such people of sloth. It would brand them as irresponsible, dispensable, shirkers and parasites. But Marxian instinct envies them. They are too well off, and therefore they should be revolted against. Marx has inoculated his proletariat with a contempt for work. His fanatical disciples wish to destroy all culture in order to decrease the amount of indispensable work. Martin Luther praised the simplest manual activity as pleasing to God. Goethe wrote of the demands of the day. Yet Marx dreamed of the proletarian Phaeton who would own everything without any effort. This is, after all, the meaning of the expropriation of the blessed, and as far as English instinct is concerned, he was right. What the Englishman calls bliss, business success that saves physical work and makes one a gentleman, is good for all Englishmen. But for us, it is obscene. It smacks of mobs and snobs. The kind of ethics informs his economic thinking. It was the Manchester School all over again. It is exactly like the thinking of Cobden, who at the very same time was leading the Whig free trade theory to victory. Marx opposed the form of capitalism that derived its justification from Bentham and Shaftesbury and was formulated by Adam Smith. But since he was a critic only, negative and uncreative, he took over his principles from the very thing he was fighting. Work was for him a commodity, not an obligation. That is the core of his political economics. His ethics were the ethics of big business. Not that business is unethical, but we can read between the lines his opinions that the labourer is a fool not to engage in it. And labourers have understood him. The battle for higher wages became a kind of investment speculation. The worker was now a merchant selling his product, work. The trick about Marx's famous surplus value thesis is that it was considered as spoils to be carried off by the successful merchant from the opponent's stores. It was not to be presented to him for nothing. Class egoism thus became a universal principle. The labourers not only wanted to do business, he wanted to corner the whole market. The true Marxist is hostile to the state, and for the very same reason as the Whig, it hinders him in the ruthless exercise of his private business interest. Marxism is the capitalism of the working class. Consider Darwin. who was just as important to Marx as Malthus and Cobden. Business is conceived of throughout as a struggle for existence. In industry, the employer engages in commerce with the commodity money, while the worker does likewise with the commodity work. Marx wished to deprive capital of the right to private profit, but the only thing he could think of as a substitute was the worker's right to private profit. That is unsocialistic, but typically English. Marx became an Englishman on one other score as well. In his mind, the state does not exist. He thought statelessly in terms of society. Like parliamentary practice in England, his economic world functions as a two-party system with nothing above the parties. Within his scheme, there can only be combat and no arbitration, only victory or defeat, only the dictatorship of one of the two parties. The Communist Manifesto calls for a dictatorship of the good proletarian party over the evil capitalist party. Marx saw no alternatives. The Prussian socialist state existed beyond this good and evil. It is the whole people, and in the face of its absolute authority, the two Marxian parties are simply parties, minorities that serve the general weal. From a strictly technological viewpoint, socialism is the principle of public service. In the final analysis, every worker has the status not of a businessman, but of a public servant, as does every employer. There are public servants of industry, commerce, traffic, and the military. This system was realised in the grander style in the Egyptian culture and again, though quite differently, in China. It represents the inner form of Western political civilization, and it already became manifest from the Gothic cities with their professional guilds and corporations. A symbolic expression of the system of the Gothic cathedral, in which every element was a necessary part of the dynamic whole, Marx was unable to comprehend this. In the imagination and creative talent extended only so far as to convert a society of private businessmen into a society of private workers. As a critic, he was first-rate. As a creator, he was impotent. This was proved by his constant retreat from the question of how he imagined the form government would take in his gigantic universal mechanism, and by his dilettantist praise of the partisan council system of 1871, which originated under the extraordinary conditions of a besieged city, but was powerless anyway. One cannot learn how to be creative by reading Marx. Either one is creative or one is not. The social democracy of the 19th century produced but one grand-style creative personality, a politician who didn't write but knew how to govern. Auguste Bebel. He was definitely not the most intellectual member of the party, but he was its one and only organiser. A true ruler, whose talents other than intellect in a literary sense. Napoleon does not tolerate any book writers in his entourage. The economic Darwinism of the Englishman, together with the Marxian two-class system, led to the adoption of the natural weapon to be used in the war between the real merchants and the merchandising labourers, the strike. By means of the strike, the commodity work is withheld from the buyer. By means of the opponent's strike, the lockout, the commodity money is withheld from the buyer. A reserve army of workers secures the market for the buyers of money, while a reserve army of employers, labour shortage, does the same for the buyers of work. The strike is the most unsocialistic aspect of Marxism. It is the classical sign of its origins in the businessman's philosophy that Marx adhered to by instinct and habit. In the true state, work is not a commodity, but a duty towards the common interest, and there is no gradation. This is Prussian-style democratization of ethical values among the various kinds of work. The judge and the scholar perform work just as much as the miner and the lathe operator. In our German Revolution, it was English thinking that planned for the worker to expropriate the rest of the people by squeezing as much money as possible out of the least amount of work, and by lauding his commodity above all others. One of the preconditions of a strike is that the people exist only as parties, not as a state. Another Marxist, that is to say English idea, is the open negotiation of wage increases and the unilateral determination of wage scales following the success of the proletarian party. The Prussian way of doing things is for the state to determine wages impartially for each kind of work, planning the scales carefully according to total economic situation at any given time in the interest of all people and not of any one profession. That is the principle of salary scales for civil servants, made to apply to all occupations. It includes the prohibition of the strike, for it regards this as a private commercial device inimical to state interests. The power to set wage scales is removed from both employer and employee as it becomes a privilege of a general economic council, thus ensuring that each party will operate within the same firm boundaries as they have had to in other areas of management and of work practice. With reference to Prussian socialist man's inborn political patterns, Marxism is senseless. Marxism can deny and perhaps weaken these patterns, but like everything that is vital and natural, they will prove stronger than all theory. Marx's scheme is most at home in England. There is better understood than true socialism, as the actual commencement of hostilities between the economic parties has brought old-style parliamentarism to an end. The two parties of wealth, formed by the upper class, were politically constituted and were in basic agreement on economic questions. Even then, in mid-century, during the final stages of classical parliamentarism, the battle was fought over a free trade system and the Whigs emerged victorious. The combatants at all times adhered to the traditional proprieties. Tories and Whigs differed only in that they favoured either war and conquest or commercial infiltration, courage or piratical cunning. Now, however, an economic antithesis has caused the appearance of two new parties, a money party and a work party, and this battle can no longer be fought with parliamentary methods. The point at issue is no longer a formality, it is now a matter of concrete things, and as long as English are unwilling to yield to the foreign principle of the state as an impartial authority, the only possible outcome is the complete suppression of one economic party by the other. Marx took this particular image of industrial England, an image that was very schematic indeed and seen from a very questionable perspective, and by a quick change of focus made it extend over all of history. He claims that his economic calculations were valid for all of human society, adding that they were in fact the only important element in the entire course of history. In doing this, he resembled Darwin, who likewise proceeded from Malthus and asserted that his theories were valid for all organisms, whereas in reality they hold only for the highly developed anthropoids. His system becomes absurd when one tries to make such details as a selection, mimicry and hereditary conform to the life history of bacteria or corals. The materialist view of history, which postulates economic conditions as cause in the physical sense, and religion, laws, customs, art, and science as effect, doubtless has its persuasive aspects in the late period of Western cultures, for it appeals to the mentality of irreligious and traditional urban people. Not because economic conditions are in fact a cause, but because art and religion have become empty, lifeless and external, and because they now linger on as the pale shadow of the only strongly developed form that identifies our age. Precisely this state of affairs is symptomatically English, the notion of religion as Kant, of art as comfort for the upper class and its arms for the lower, art for the masses, has accompanied the English style of living during the infiltration of other countries. Hegel stands above Marx, Marx below the level of historical actuality. Take away Hegel's metaphysics and you will discover a political thinker with a sense of reality unequalled in modern philosophy. As a Prussian by intellectual choice, he placed the state at the centre of his extraordinary, profound, well-nigh Goethean vision of historical development. Whereas Marx, the Englishman by choice, assigned to the economic life the central role in his Darwinian and mechanistic theory of historical evolution. He would call it progress. According to Hegel, the state is the creative force of history, and history means politics. He never used the term human society. The high state officials of post-Marx generation were mostly Hegelians. Marx, on the other hand, conceived of history without the state as an arena of jousting parties, as a conflict of private economic interests. The materialist concept is the English concept of history. It reflects the countenance of the independent nation of Vikings and businessmen. But the intellectual and spiritual preconditions for this mode of thought no longer exist. The 19th century was the century of natural science. The 20th century belongs to psychology. We no longer believe in the power of reason over life. We feel that life controls reason. Familiarity with the ways of human beings is more important to us than general and abstract ideals. We have lost our optimism and become skeptics. What concerns to us is not what ought to be, but what shall be. Rather than be slaves of ideals, we want to be able to control reality. The logic of natural science, the concatenation of cause and effect, seems to us superficial. The only thing that can testify to the profundity of historical change is the logic of organic existence, destiny and an instinct that can be felt and seen as an all-powerful agent in the historical process. Marxism is an ideology. That this is so is evident from the way it divides up history, a technique adopted by the materialists after the strength of Christian faith has waned. The evolutionary path leads for them from antiquity via the Middle Ages to modern times, and at the end we are to describe the perfect Marxist ideal, the earthly paradise. It is senseless to try to contradict this image. Our task is to give modern man a new perspective that will necessarily produce a new image. Life has no goal. Mankind has no goal. The existence of this universe in which we humans play of a tiny episode on our little planet is much too majestic a thing to be explained by such puny slogans as happiness for the largest number. The greatness of the universal drama lies in its aimlessness. Goethe was aware of this. What we are called upon to do is to render the greatest possible meaning to the life that has been granted to us, to the reality that surrounds us and into which destiny has placed us. We must live in such a way that we can be proud of ourselves. We must act in such a way that some parts of us will live on in the process of reality that is heading towards eventual completion. We are not human beings en sich. This was a fact in yesterday's ideology. Cosmopolitanism is a wretched word. We are persons of a particular century, a particular nation, a particular circle, a particular type. These are the necessary conditions unto which we can give meaning and depth to existence, by beings, doers, even if we do with words. The more we fill out the area within these given boundaries, the greater will be our effect. Plato was an Athenian, Caesar a Roman, Goethe a German. They were so first and foremost is the reason for their universal and timeless importance. It is with this knowledge that today, in the midst of the German Revolution, we can point to Marxism and Socialism as opposing forces. Socialism, Prussianism, as it is not yet understood, is a real entity of the highest order. Marxism is literature. Literature can become obsolete. Reality either conquers or dies. We need only compare socialist criticism as the heart of international conversations with but one socialist fact, the party of August Bebel. The popular phrase about ideas making history, when understood as it should be, is nothing but the special pleading of literary gossips. Ideas cannot be expressed. An artist can see them, a thinker can feel them, a statesman or soldier can make them real. Ideas become conscious only through blood, instinctively, not by means of abstract contemplation. They make their existence known by the lifestyle of peoples, the symbolism of deeds and accomplishments, and whether or not people are aware of them, either correctly or falsely, is a trifling matter. Life is of first and last importance, and life has no system, no program, and no reason. It exists for itself and by itself, and the profound orderliness in which it manifests itself can only be felt or envisioned, and then perhaps described, but not analysed in terms of good and evil, right or wrong, desirable and undesirable. For this reason, Marxism is not a true idea. It combines in rational, arbitrary fashion with the visible symbols and patterns of two ideas. The entire method of Marxist thinking is a thing of the moment. It is effective because every people has employed its concepts as weapons. Whether or not they have been correctly understood is unimportant. They are effective because the sound of words and the force of oratory have made people believe in something. What they have believed in is, once again, the immutable idea of their own lives, their own blood. Today, Marxism is collapsing amidst the clamorous orgy of its attempt to become reality. Within the year of 1918, the Communist Manifesto has entered upon a career as a literary curiosity like that of the Contract Social after 1793. True instinctive socialism, the expression of the old Prussian mode of life, once was carried off in a literary sojourn to England to be diluted into an anti-English theory. It is now on its way back to an awareness of the origins of its full meaning.